Hello everyone, this is once again Chess Teacher Tui, and I'm going to look over another tactic puzzle with you. So what I like to do is I like to set these tactic puzzles up and then solve them with you so that you and I can go over the thinking together and solve it together. Unfortunately, my last attempt at a video got interrupted after I had solved the puzzle successfully. So unfortunately, I have already solved this one, but we can still go through it together and I can share with you my thinking. So when we're analyzing a position, the first thing we might think about is what's the material situation? Well, white and black have exchanged one set of knights is off the board, and black has it looks like a one pawn advantage. One, two, three, four, five, six. One, two, three, four, five pawns for white. However, it seems that white's pieces are much better placed than black's. You see these two very active bishops on very good diagonals. Dark squared bishop is on the main diagonal, and the light squared bishop is in line with the enemy king. Definitely something to be thinking about in terms of tactics. So even though there's the pawn and the bishop in between, there is definitely something to be concerned about with that. Also, you have the rook in line with the king on the pawn, so this pawn is pinned potentially. And also, more than that, is just the fact that there's this opportunity for white's pieces to really get to the king. As we start any position, we ask if whether or not there are any threats we need to be immediately aware of. And of course, that threat is self-evident. The king's bishop, dark squared bishop on f8 for black, is attacking white's queen. So when I was first going through this puzzle, because of the rook here and because of the potential of attacking on this file, the first thing I thought maybe was that it was a queen sacrifice puzzle. I mean, that would make sense. I mean, the queen is under attack, so that threat needs to be dealt with somehow. So it would make sense to me. The first thing I thought was perhaps queen takes on h7, king takes h7, rook to h3 check, and then if the king retreats to g8, then the rook can mate on h8. As I've said before, it's important that when we do tactics puzzles, that we don't move the pieces around too much, that we work on our board vision and our imagination. But I'll show you what I'm referring to and also show you how I discovered, without moving the pieces, that that doesn't work. Uh, Queen takes pawn, king takes pawn, check. Everything's going well so far. And if the king goes back to g8, then the rook finishes on h8. The problem with that is very simply that the king does not have to retreat there. He can interpose with the bishop, and once he interposes with the bishop, white has just sacrificed his queen, and the rest of his attack is blunted. Now, I was thinking that maybe that was still the solution. Perhaps then maybe you sacrifice the rook, check, and he still can't go back here because of the mate. So once again, he attacks, and then maybe after the rook lift, maybe all can be well, because it seems like uh, black could be, in trouble again. The problem is there's definitely an answer for that as well, because even though he does have the rook lift, first of all, the queen now has a check, right, and then take check and all sorts of other possible shenanigans. But something even simpler to try to get through the position is black is not trapped on these squares as soon as he does something as simple as pawn to g5. Now, he doesn't have to do that immediately, but it does give him a flight square, and now all of a sudden it's a lot more difficult for white to be able to get to the enemy king. And besides that, after this bishop is now free to interpose over here. So in spite of the ability to try to sack another rook and bring another rook into the play, this is not a sound line. So that was the first line I looked at, but it was not correct. And I had to calculate all of that from that initial position. So now I have to try to find something else. Another thing I was looking at, perhaps, was maybe I simply relocate the queen. After all, the queen is under attack, and I was thinking that if only white had an extra move, if only white queen's queen could move here, then here, because in this position, even if it's black to move, the goose of black is cooked because unfortunately, uh, black simply can't defend both of these squares at once. Now, it's true that in that position, uh, the bishop could move back, but then if the bishop were to move back to vacate that thing, then the bishop could check and have mate there. The problem is that white doesn't get an extra move to do something like that. But it was actually that thinking that led me to the solution that I needed, because I realized that this would be a huge problem for white if I could only get my queen to that f6 square. So a key again is to think about all the pieces that are in play and why white's position is so better. Number one, all of these pieces are able to be active. Another thought, just to share the fullness of what I was thinking about, was also the idea that if I could only deflect this bishop off of this square. One of the things I was thinking about is if only I could get my knight to e7 check, that would force bishop captures on e7, and then the queen would be free to check the king on g7. And that also is not the correct move, simply because there's no good path and not enough time to get the knight to e7. d5 is covered by the knight and the pawn and the rook, and there's no alternative way to get to that square in a reasonable amount of time. But again, it's just another thing to be thinking about in terms of the overall tactical scheme. Most of the things I was thinking about in regards to this position were what I considered the three main attacking pieces: the queen, the bishop, and the rook. But truthfully, the piece that makes the difference in this setup is actually white's king's bishop. The great grandmaster Siegbert Tarrasch, who was the teacher of Germany and maybe the best chess player in the world in the early 1890s, he used to say that the king's bishop was his favorite piece, and he used to love any time he could place his bishop on this light square diagonal. It's just so good for attacking the position. And the key to this position is understanding how it's actually the bishop's pressure on that diagonal that makes the difference in this position. So white does have a killer move in this position, and it's all surrounding the fact that black has very, very few responses to one of white's checks. So I'm going to pause, and I'm going to give you a chance to find what Mata would call the killer move, and then I will show you the answer. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and found the solution. The killer move is rook takes g6. Now, I've already told you that the killer move is rook takes g6, but it's important to try to figure out why that's the killer move without moving the pieces too much. So if you want, you can pause the video here and try to look at that position without moving the pieces if you'd like. But let's look at it now, just after rook takes g6. Now black has a very limited number of responses. He can either capture the rook with either the pawn on h7 or the bishop on f7, or he can interpose with the bishop. Now, interposition, I think, seems obviously bad, because then queen takes bishop mate. Very, very simple. And the problem with the fact that this would remove the obstacle of the queen to h8, if pawn takes rook, then we know that the queen can mate in one on h8. So what that leaves then is bishop takes rook, which then removes the guard on the e6 pawn. And I'm going to stop this video now, and I'll resume in the next video. Actually, no, I won't. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you the finish. And then bishop takes. And as you see, he has to block, right? He comes back. But now, queen is here. Bishop can't move, and there's absolutely nothing that he can do.